Halifax Harbor smells of salt and coal smoke on the morning of the 6th of December, 1917, and the Mont Blanc is already burning. She sits low in the water, lower than a ship should sit, her hull radiating heat that the dock workers on Pier 6 can feel from 40 yards away. Black columns rise into a cold Nova Scotia sky, bending slightly in the harbor wind, carrying with them the sharp chemical reek of burning benzol, a smell the men on the pier cannot name but that the ship's crew, rowing hard for the Dartmouth shore, understand. With absolute precision, a burning ship in a war harbor is not yet a crisis. It is a spectacle. The kind of industrial accident that produces a story for the evening meal, a thing to describe to a wife or a foreman, the morning's excitement before the real work begins. Men lean forward on the pier rail. Children press their faces to the windows of the Richmond School, 2 blocks from the waterfront. The fire tug Stella Maris moves toward the vessel with professional purpose, her crew readying hoses for a fire they do not yet understand. The Mont Blanc drifts slowly on the harbor current, trailing smoke, her deck alive with orange flame. And she is headed for Pier 6 with the unhurried certainty of a tide. In her holds, sealed from the open air, 2,300 tons of wet picric acid are beginning to change. The moisture that stabilizes them is leaving. 10 tons of gun cotton wait in their casings. 200 tons of trinitrotoluene wait behind steel plating that is growing warm to the touch. The ship is not threatening. She is drifting. She is burning. She is watched by thousands of people who have no reason to move away from her, and that absence of reason, that comfortable, accumulated, institutionally validated absence of reason is itself the weapon. The Mont Blanc was not a warship. She carried no guns, no armor plating, no explosion suppression system, no compartmentalization engineered for what she held. She was a merchant freighter, built in 1899, 3,121 gross tons of standard cargo hull. Registered to a civilian shipping company and crewed by men whose ordinary work was moving goods across oceans. On the morning of December 6th, she held more destructive energy than any single object anywhere in North America. To understand how this ended, you have to go back to the logic that put her there to 1,914, and to the men who decided that a civilian ship could carry the mathematics of industrial-scale death. The Western Front consumed artillery shells the way a furnace consumes wood continuously, without satisfaction, in quantities that strained every industrial system feeding it. By 1915, Allied planners had calculated that active artillery sectors required approximately 50,000 rounds per day to sustain fire superiority against fortified German positions, and the combined foundries of Britain, France, Canada, and the United States could barely keep pace with production, let alone transport. Ships were the only mechanism capable of moving war materiel across the Atlantic at the scale the front demanded. Purpose-built munitions vessels existed in insufficient numbers. The answer was conversion civilian freighters requisitioned under wartime authority, their holds emptied of peacetime cargo and refilled with the chemistry of industrial destruction. No armor plating was added to these hulls. No explosion suppression bulkheads were installed between cargo compartments. No engineering specification required compartmentalization to separate shock-sensitive materials from one another during transit. The Mont Blanc was one of hundreds of merchant hulls absorbed into this system. Her operators contracted under the same wartime logic that governed every decision in the supply chain. The cargo must move, the cargo must arrive, and the margin for delay was measured not in safety assessments, but in the daily shell consumption of a front that could not wait. French munitions authorities certified the loading. Allied transport officials allocated the vessel. The harbor at Halifax received her without special protocol because no special protocol existed for what she carried. The war machine had industrialized the movement of destruction to the point where its most dangerous cargo traveled in the same hulls as peacetime freight, on the same routes, through the same civilian ports, watched by the same dock workers who had spent years unloading timber and dry goods. The war did not care what kind of ship carried its ammunition, only that the ammunition arrived. The loading in New York Harbor, completed over December 1st and 2nd, 1917. Followed an internal logic that was coherent by the standards of its era and catastrophic by the standards of chemistry. Captain Aimé Lamet oversaw a cargo manifest approved by French naval authorities and certified against the dangerous goods classifications then in use. 2,300 tons of wet picric acid occupied the lower holds. Wet picric acid was the responsible choice, shock stable when fully saturated with water. It would not detonate from the ordinary vibrations and minor impacts of an Atlantic crossing, from the roll of the ship in heavy seas, or the routine mechanical handling of cargo at port. Above the picric acid, 200 tons of trinitrotoluene, 10 tons of gun cotton, and then, loaded onto the open deck in sealed steel drums, 35 tons of benzol, a highly flammable petroleum derivative placed above the holds because the regulations of the era treated it as a separate category from high explosives. A flammable liquid rather than a detonating agent, subject to different handling rules and different stowage requirements. Every decision in the loading sequence reflected the engineering and chemical knowledge of 1917. The wet picric acid was stable. The benzol was positioned at distance from the explosive holds. The gun cotton was properly packed. The manifest was complete, signed, and filed with the appropriate authorities. The ship was certified to sail. Here is what no calculation addressed, what no regulation required anyone to consider. If the benzol ignited and burned long enough against the deck, it would conduct sufficient heat through the plating and into the sealed holds below to drive the moisture from the picric acid. Heat removes water. Picric acid without its water saturation is no longer a stabilized shipping material. It becomes trinitrophenol in its fully sensitized state, one of the most powerful detonating compounds available to 19th century chemistry, capable of initiating a complete detonation sequence through everything stored around it. The cargo had been engineered to survive a normal voyage. It had not been engineered to survive a fire on its own deck. Every loading decision was rational. The sequence of those rational decisions was not. Halifax Harbor in December 1917 was the primary assembly point for North Atlantic convoys carrying men, weapons, food, and fuel to Allied forces in Europe and the Narrows. The channel connecting the Bedford Basin anchorage to the open outer harbor was its unavoidable choke point, 900 feet wide at its narrowest passage, 40 to 60 vessels transiting daily under wartime pressure. The traffic management system that governed this movement depended entirely on convention and professional seamanship. Inbound ships kept to the Dartmouth side of the channel, outbound ships to the Halifax side. With no physical barriers, no enforcement mechanism capable of intervening against a vessel already underway, and no real-time communication system capable of coordinating emergency stops across multiple ships in motion simultaneously, Commander Frederick Wyatt of the Royal Canadian Navy held the position of examination officer responsible for authorizing vessels to enter the harbor through the anti-submarine net at the harbor mouth. But his authority was a gate function he could permit or deny entry, not manage live traffic within the Narrows once ships were moving. The channel trusted its users. On the night of December 5th, the Norwegian relief ship Imo sat at anchor in the basin, delayed by a coal delivery that had arrived late, her schedule disrupted. Her captain, Håkon, from anxious to clear the Narrows early on the morning of the 6th and recover lost time on his passage to New York. She departed before the morning's lane conventions had been fully established by the day's earlier traffic. She was moving faster than harbor regulations permitted, and she was displaced from her correct lane. Two ships, each following their own navigation logic, each signaling intentions the other misread, were converging in a channel 900 feet wide, with no mechanism to stop them. The Narrows was the throat of the Allied war effort. On December 6th, something became lodged in it. The collision itself was modest by the violent standards of maritime accident. The sequence of events that morning, the contested lane signals, the misread flag communications between vessels, the final maneuvers executed in opposite directions by two captains, each convinced they were acting correctly, would occupy months of inquest testimony and years of legal proceedings. What is mechanically certain is this. The IMO's bow made contact with the Mont Blanc's forward starboard side in a glancing strike that opened hull plating and spilled benzol from damaged deck drums across the forward section of the ship. The friction of steel against steel produced sparks. The benzol caught immediately, burning with the blue-orange intensity of a petroleum fire in cold open air. Pilot Francis Mackey, aboard the Mont Blanc in his official navigation capacity, understood within seconds what the fire meant. So did Lamed. Every officer who knew the cargo manifest knew that the fire now burning on the forward deck was not a containable event. It was a countdown, measuring itself against the thermal tolerance of the sealed holds below. Their response was the only rational action available to men who understood the chemistry. Abandon ship immediately, without attempting to fight the fire, launch the lifeboats, and put as much distance and water between themselves and the hull as possible. They rowed hard for the Dartmouth shore, pulling against the cold harbor water with the focused urgency of men who had done the arithmetic. From the Halifax waterfront, from the piers and the school windows and the rail yards of the Richmond district, observers watched the Mont Blanc's crew row away from a burning ship and interpreted what they saw as panic or dereliction, men abandoning their vessel without cause. Some accounts record anger from the dock, the contempt of observers who believed the crew was leaving a manageable fire to burn without reason. The crew knew exactly what was burning. The 9,000 people watching from shore did not. By 1917, Halifax had processed hundreds of munitions transits through the Narrows without a single catastrophic incident, and that accumulation of safe passages had produced exactly the institutional confidence that safety systems should never be allowed to generate. No regulation required public disclosure of cargo types for vessels authorized through the harbor. The civilian population of the Richmond district, the working-class North End neighborhood built dense and close to the waterfront, because that was where the employment was, had no knowledge of what moved through the water beside. Their homes and schools. Workers crossed on the Dartmouth ferry. Children walked to the Richmond school, past the waterfront they had always walked past. The Harbor Authority's operational logs recorded no formal emergency notification procedure for shore populations in the event of fire aboard a munitions vessel transiting the Narrows. The successful transits accumulated in the record books and validated the system in the only language institutional confidence understands. Nothing has gone wrong yet. Therefore, the system is adequate. Each safe passage made the next feel more routine, more controlled, more like an ordinary feature of a working harbor. The hazard was not secret. Precisely wartime secrecy about specific cargo types was standard practice, and the harbor personnel who knew what the ships carried did not speak of it to civilians because that was the protocol. The hazard was invisible, not by accident, but by design. Every safe passage made the next one feel safer. The harbor had passed 1,000 ships. It would not pass this one. The Mont Blanc drifted burning toward Pier 6 for approximately 18 minutes after the collision. 18 minutes is a long time. Long enough for the Stella Maris to close the distance and begin hosing water onto a benzol fire that water cannot suppress. Long enough for the crowd on the pier to grow rather than disperse. Long enough for the Richmond school to remain open and unwarned, its students at their lessons, some of them drawn to the windows by the visible smoke column rising above the waterfront. Long enough for telegraph dispatcher Vincent Coleman, working at the Richmond rail yard a short distance north of Pier 6, to receive urgent word through harbor channels that the burning vessel carried a munitions cargo. Coleman faced a decision in those final minutes that his subsequent actions clarify without ambiguity. Incoming passenger and freight trains were approaching Halifax on the Richmond rail line, which ran directly through the neighborhood that would be destroyed. Coleman remained at his telegraph key and transmitted a warning to stations along the line, reporting the fire and the nature of the cargo, and directing trains to stop short of the Richmond station. He did not evacuate. He stayed at the instrument. His message halted at least one incoming passenger train that would otherwise have been at the platform when the wave arrived. That decision, and the sacrifice it represented, is documented in the accounts compiled by survivors and relief workers in the days following the disaster and has been formally recognized in the years since. At 9:04:35 in the morning of the 6th of December 1917, Vincent Coleman was killed at his post. At 9:04:35, the Richmond district ceased to exist. The chemistry performed as chemistry must, without hesitation, without the possibility of interruption, with the absolute mechanical obedience of physical law. The benzol fire had burned across the forward deck for 18 minutes, radiating heat downward through the steel plating into the sealed cargo holds. The wet picric acid, contained in its drums and casings in the lower hold, lost its moisture to the sustained thermal exposure. Its molecular structure reorganized from stabilized shipping material into sensitized primary explosive. The gun cotton initiated the detonation sequence. The picric acid, 2,300 tons of it, now dry, now fully reactive, now performing exactly as its chemistry demanded, amplified the chain through the full explosive inventory, with a force multiplication that the individual components, considered separately, could not have produced. The TNT completed the reaction. The total explosive yield has been estimated at approximately 2.9 kilotons of TNT equivalent, with some technical analyses placing the figure at 3 kilotons. The precise value depends on assumptions about confinement, geometry, and detonation sequencing that the event itself rendered impossible to verify directly. Every estimate agrees on the order of magnitude. Every estimate agrees on the conclusion: the largest man-made explosion in the history of industrial warfare to that date, a record the Halifax detonation held until the Trinity test in the New Mexico desert in July 1945. The wet picric acid, chosen because it was the stable option, the responsible choice, the material least likely to cause a problem, was the primary amplifier that made the detonation total and complete. The ship didn't explode. She performed exactly as her chemistry demanded. No one had done the calculation. The overpressure wave moved at the speed of sound and was indifferent to everything in its path. The Richmond district absorbed the wave's full force. The neighborhood had been built of wood, close to the water, by working families who needed proximity to the docks and could afford nothing more substantial. The wave disassembled the structures with the comprehensive efficiency of physics, not burning them, not toppling them, but taking them apart at the level of their connections, separating walls from floors and roofs from walls, and foundations from everything that had stood on them. Streets that had existed at 9:04 a.m. did not exist at 9:05. 1,600 acres of Halifax were destroyed or severely damaged in the radius extending outward from Pier 6. Window glass shattered in buildings 80 kilometers away. The town of Truro reported broken panes across its commercial district that morning, the sound arriving seconds after the glass. A harbor tsunami generated by the sudden massive displacement of harbor water reached the Dartmouth shore with force sufficient to carry wreckage hundreds of yards inland. Reports from that morning described a white-gray cloud rising above the harbor to heights visible from the surrounding hills, a column of vaporized ship and water and demolished city rising into the cold December sky. Approximately 1,600 people died at the moment of detonation or within minutes of it from the direct effects of the blast. 9,000 more were injured, many critically and permanently. Among those injured, approximately 200 suffered severe damage to their eyesight, or complete blindness from the glass of the windows they had been standing at, drawn forward by the spectacle of a burning ship in the final seconds before the wave arrived, their faces close to panes that the overpressure turned into projectiles moving faster than the human nervous system can register. The blizzard arrived the next morning, a full northeastern storm that buried the debris fields under 2 feet of snow and complicated the movement of rescue teams through streets that no longer had the landmarks teams used to navigate them. The city that had not yet identified all of its dead was buried before the counting was complete. Justice Arthur Drysdale convened his formal inquiry into the collision in the weeks that followed, and the proceedings were meticulous, extensive, and precisely wrong in their focus. Navigation records were examined with care. Inquest testimony from pilot Francis Mackey, from surviving officers and harbor personnel, from witnesses who had observed the morning's movements in the Narrows, was compiled and cross-examined across weeks of hearings. The movements of both vessels through the channel were reconstructed in technical detail. The competing navigation decisions analyzed against harbor regulations and professional maritime standards. Drysdale concluded that the collision was the fault of the Mont Blanc's crew and her pilot. Lemedic and Mackey faced criminal charges that were eventually dismissed for want of sufficient evidence to sustain a conviction. The Exchequer Court of Canada subsequently found both vessels equally at fault. The Supreme Court of Canada, ruling in 1919, assigned sole responsibility to the IMO. The legal machinery worked. It produced years of proceedings, thousands of pages of testimony, and a final legal determination about navigation fault that was, within its own strictly defined terms, a reasonable exercise of judicial reasoning. What those thousands of pages did not contain, what no proceeding, no commission, no formal regulatory review on any side of the Atlantic produced, was a single examination of why 2,925 tons of high explosive had been authorized to transit a 900-foot civilian channel surrounded by residential neighborhoods, without any emergency notification system for shore populations, without any exclusion zone protocol for a burning munitions vessel, without any procedure that might have used those 18 drifting, burning minutes to move people away from the windows they were watching from. The inquiry measured the debris field. It documented the navigation error. It did not measure the system that transformed a navigation error into 1,600 immediate deaths. They found fault with the pilots. They did not find fault with the system that placed 2,925 tons of explosives in a civilian harbor with no warning to anyone on shore. The geography of destruction was not random, and the Halifax Relief Commission's surveys recorded its shape with the flat precision of administrative necessity. The Richmond District working class, wooden, built against the waterfront, was gone. Fort Needham Hill, rising immediately behind the neighborhood, created a partial blast shadow that deflected a portion of the wave's force away from the city's more prosperous southern districts. The Commission administered relief and reconstruction housing for approximately 6,000 newly homeless residents, the overwhelming majority of them working-class families whose entire neighborhood now existed only as a debris field being sorted for salvageable timber. The class geography of the catastrophe was not a product of the explosion's intention. Physics does not intend, but it was a product of the city's prior intentions, of decades of decisions about where workers could afford to live and where they therefore did. Massachusetts sent a relief train south from Boston within hours of receiving the first news dispatches, carrying medical personnel, supplies, and ophthalmological specialists for the hundreds blinded by glass. A response so immediate and substantial that Halifax has formally commemorated it every December since, sending a Christmas tree to Boston as an annual acknowledgement of that first generosity. The Relief Commission's housing survey recorded the destruction's class contours without commentary. The explosion did not discriminate, but the city it destroyed already had. The armistice came 11 months after the explosion, on the 11th of November 1918, and the war's end dissolved the operational pressure that had made munitions transport reform politically impossible while fighting continued. But reform did not arrive with the peace in any swift or comprehensive form. The specific cargo combination that had produced the detonation wet picric acid and benzol loaded together aboard a civilian hull without thermal separation or containment engineering had not been formally prohibited in any Allied shipping code before the guns fell silent. Internal reviews conducted by British Admiralty transport authorities and by Canadian harbour officials in the months following December 6th produced recommendations that moved through bureaucratic channels at the pace of institutional change, which is to say, slowly, with resistance, and always subordinate to more immediate political pressures. The investigation had documented the event. It had not redesigned the system that produced it. The war ended 11 months later. The regulations that allowed the Mont Blanc to exist had not changed. The development of international maritime dangerous goods law across the following decades drew on Halifax as one of its foundational cases, the catastrophe that demonstrated in arithmetic that could not be disputed what civilian proximity to uncontrolled explosive cargo produces when a navigation error and a chemical sequence align. The regulatory frameworks that eventually governed hazardous cargo classification, stowage separation requirements, and port emergency notification procedures were built across the mid-20th century through international bodies working at the pace of treaty negotiation. And their construction was shaped as much by the accumulation of subsequent incidents as by the singular shock of the 6th of December 1917. The reform was genuine. Meanwhile, the Mont Blanc's anchor recovered from the field where the detonation had carried it. Kilometers from where the ship had been, was mounted in Needham Park in Halifax as a memorial object. The largest surviving piece of the vessel. It weighs approximately half a ton. It sits on a concrete plinth in a residential neighborhood, and people walk past it on ordinary mornings without always stopping. Which is perhaps the most honest possible relationship a city can have with the evidence of what it once survived. The machine that held 2,925 tons of explosive chemistry was vaporized so completely that no hull section of meaningful size was ever recovered. They put the anchor in a park. They did not put the regulation in a treaty for another generation. Every December 6th, at exactly 9:35 in the morning, the bells of the Fort Needham Memorial Bell Tower ring out across what was once the Richmond district. The tower stands on the hill above the rebuilt North End, looking down over a neighborhood reconstructed in brick and concrete by people who came after those who were taken. A community that carries the event in its street names and its civic calendar without having lived through it. The ceremony has continued for decades, attended by descendants and officials and ordinary Halifax residents who pause in their morning routines when the bells begin. The last survivors of the explosion have all now passed. The youngest among them were infants in December 1917, carried through collapsed structures by parents or neighbors, and they lived into old age, carrying the physics of that morning, in the specific quality of their silences, in partial vision, and in scars that winter cold made ache for the rest of their lives. They described when they spoke of it at all. Before any sensation the nervous system had a category for, that light was the last thing Vincent Coleman saw from his telegraph key. It was the last thing the children at the Richmond school windows saw before the glass arrived. It was what every surviving account reaches for when ordinary language fails, which it always does. The Mont Blanc's bell was recovered from the harbor floor in the years following the explosion and is preserved in a Nova Scotia museum, the second artifact the ship produced alongside the anchor. One bell, one anchor, and the harbor sediment below the place where she had been, still holding iron trace from a hull that ceased to exist in a fraction of a second on a cold Thursday morning in the second to last year of the war that was supposed to end all wars. The ship exists now as a debris catalog, a yield estimate, a legal record of navigation fault, and a precise moment in time when the bells of Fort Needham ring and Halifax pauses. The machine that concentrated more destructive energy than any civilian harbor had been designed to absorb released that energy completely and was gone, not decommissioned, not replaced by a safer design, not retired after a career of controlled service, but simply and absolutely erased, vaporized by the chemistry it had been trusted to carry across an ocean to a war that needed it. What remained was the silence over the harbor, the cold water above the place where a hull had been, the bells marking a second that changed what industrial-scale logistics can ask a civilian city to absorb. At 9:35 every December 6th, Halifax goes quiet. The ship cannot be remembered because there is nothing left to remember. Only the silence where 2,925 tons of rational industrial logic used to be.